monsters. They exist among us, and sometimes they win. Even the devil was an angel once. The world has its own rules, and these rules are not human. Some of us seek answers to the origin and existence of cryptids and the unexplained. Join us as we venture beyond the known and accepted boundaries. Welcome to our nightmare. I think you're going to like it. Where we explore the strange and unexplained. I'm your host, Lon Strickler. Thanks for joining me. Now, if you enjoy our content, and then please subscribe, hit the like button, and share our presentations. And please feel free to comment as well. Super Chat is active during the show, so please show your support for Fams of Monsters Radio by clicking the dollar icon under the chat. You can support the channel by clicking the super thanks icon or buy me a coffee. Consideration is very much needed and appreciated. So tonight's guest, Carol Scott, developed an interest in cryptozoology after catching a late night episode of Animal X. This interest in her previous work in journalism led to her research and write her first book, The Cryptids of Asia and Oceania, The Myths and Historical Roots of Undiscovered Creatures. She currently works in marketing and lives with her two cats, Wallace and Asparagus, in Ontario, Canada. So, Carol, thanks for joining me this evening.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you for the great introduction.
So, you kind of took a big swing getting cryptids from Asia and Oceania. When you talk about cryptozoology, most people in the United States kind of think North America is the only place that these things are. But of course, that's just not true. We've gotten all kinds of strange encounters and sightings throughout the world. So what inspired you to do this anyway?
Yeah, a lot of it was just the focus on cryptids in North America and Loch Ness Monster. And you also have a couple in Australia that are also definitely popular, the thylacine and the yowie. But I really wanted to, provide a baseline knowledge for all the other cryptids that aren't covered as much. Mm-hmm. And that was really the main focus of the book, is just to look at those, gather every little bit of evidence I could find, and really just provide the foundation for further research into those cryptids. Mm-hmm. And, I definitely hope that, if someone reads this and goes, oh, I want to study this particular cryptid more. That was always my goal, is just to get more people interested in the cryptids from this part of the world, and hopefully, kind of develop a more worldwide sense of cryptozoology.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you kind of cover a large area with Asia and then Oceania, and I've always been interested in Oceania, just necessarily for cryptids, but for a lot of other things. Mm-hmm. But the islands and the areas, countries in those areas, they offer all kinds of opportunities for different types of research, even into paranormal, UFO, and all of that. So when you got involved with this, what surprises did you find? What were there anything that popped up that kind of surprised you?
There was a number of things. I think the overwhelming, a common theme with pretty much every cryptid was just the lack of preservation of evidence, of testimonials about cryptids in this mm-hmm. part of the world. Even something like the Yeti, which obviously is a very well-known cryptid. I'm pretty sure everyone knows that, whether they're into cryptozoology or not. A lot of the research that you could find basically starts in the 20th century as soon as Western mountaineers get there. There's not a lot of focus on, you know, what were people who live around that area seeing? How long have they been seeing it? Are there any differences between reports from locals and reports from Westerners? And that's something that comes up a lot, is just preservation of preservation of evidence. And it did make research very hard in some respects. A lot of it was, you know, having to go through very old texts, having to get access to them if they even existed. One of the cryptids in the book, the Nittawo, the primary document from which we know about them, there's actually only one physical copy that has never been digitally archived, and it's falling apart, according to a researcher that I spoke to from the area. So that's definitely something where, you know, like that, let's pretend that none of these cryptids exist. That's still part of the human experience of that area that should be preserved. And then, you know, assuming these cryptids exist, there's definitely, we would want to know how their behavior has changed. How long have they been in the area? Has anything changed? Like, that's just something you would want to know once you discover a creature. And a lot of that is not preserved. And a lot of it isn't archived. A lot of it isn't digitized. And that's definitely a major blind spot on the part of not only cryptozoologists. I'm not trying to place blame on, you know, people who basically do this in their spare time, but also, you know, scientific researchers, archivists, you know, going back to the Nittawo, and it's like, you know, you would think like this pretty interesting piece of history wouldn't necessarily just be sitting around decaying. And, you know, like that, I honestly felt very sad when the researcher told me that. And I was like, wow, we should absolutely be preserving that.
Yeah, I want to thank Peace for her donation. Very much appreciated. Yeah, you know, I think a lot of people were surprised, are surprised when information on some of these cryptids from other countries come forth in documentaries, or even, you know, even in science, you know, just like the Ibu Gogo that was actually documented in a film about a decade ago. How much of a stir there was with that, and other human hominid type of cryptids. Of course, we've got them all over the place. I mean, of course, Australia, like you said, has the Yowie and the Almas, the Amasti, Yeti, Yirin, and I mean, there's a whole slew of them, and the rock apes and other types of sightings. I mean, which kind of fascinate me, but the Ibu Gogo I thought was quite fascinating. The small hominid type beings that these villagers were very much aware of and were somewhat fearful of. And when that documentary came out, and I forget what the name of it was, but I had written about it. It was a fascinating documentary, and the individual who did the actual research did a fantastic job. But every once in a while, some of those things do come forth. And, you know, there are several cryptozoologists that, you know, that have been involved with this that we know of, who have gone in Asia. The first person I think of is Freeman from UK, who's actually does this a lot. And there are others, of course, but it's fascinating. So is there one in particular group or species that has fascinated you when you started going into all this research?
Yeah, one of the cryptids that has always fascinated me, and this goes back to very old days of watching Animal X was
Hmm.
the thylacine. A lot of that is just, I
Oh,
think they're pretty neat, and I would like for them to still be around. But,
what are
you
your
know,
thoughts on that? You think they do exist yet?
I do think that they are still in Tasmania. Um, I definitely do think at least a small population is still there. You know, like there's enough people who have seen things that it doesn't line up with dingoes. It doesn't line up with, you know, domesticated dogs. So it's either, you know, small population of thylacines or it's something else, which I guess is also interesting, but I would prefer thylacines if I had to
Yeah.
choose.
Yeah, it
And
seems that the thylacine are, for people who don't know who they are the Tasmanian tigers.
mhm,
They're you know, for the most part, a lot of them have been supposed to be seen in Australia,
mhm,
and there are a lot of researchers who believe that there are some population in Australia as well. I don't know. I have seen possible images or photographs of these things. It's hard to tell if they're actual, but I have talked to a few people who claim that they have seen them. They thought they seen them. So I don't know.
right.
I think as time goes on, we'll find out more and more. Um, you know, Australia, just like most places, is just not as wide open as it used to be. People are encroaching on these wild areas, the bush in particular,
Mhm.
and maybe we will be lucky enough to see one or have one recorded.
Yeah, definitely very possible. And, you know, like you said, there's definitely a lot of encroachment on wild territory, but there is still comparatively a lot of wild territory that doesn't necessarily get, you know, explored too often. It is explored, but, you know, there's not necessarily people going in pretty frequently, which does provide that, you know, like the plausibility.
Hmm. Hmm.
Mhm.
So, is there any part of the book or anything you've written about that you really want to emphasize on, that you really want to talk about in particular?
Yeah, I actually one of the most interesting cryptids that I covered in the book, the Nittawo. I did already bring them up, but it's such a fascinating story of one of the indigenous tribes on Sri Lanka, and they claim that there was another tribe of, you know, hairy beasts with like very long nails that would, you know, just steal their kills, you know, just generally cause havoc. So this indigenous tribe said, well, we don't want to deal with these whatever they are anymore.
Hmm.
So they rounded them all up into a cave and lit a fire at the mouth of the cave. And basically, in the legend, all the Nittawo just, you know, suffocated to death. And basically, it was a huge genocide of the Nittawo. And I was just, it's such a fascinating story that I had just never heard before. Um, and there's, you know, one of the interesting things is, you know, like there's a lot of debate over whether they're monkeys, you know, just another, you know, smaller monkeys, if they're apes, if they were even another, you know, Neanderthal type hominid,
Hmm.
which was, you know, which definitely adds a different layer to the, um, you know, killing all of them uh, talk. So it's definitely very interesting, and it's relatively recently that occurred. Bernard Hubelmans did write about the event in On the Track of Unknown Animals, and estimated that it took place at about 1800. You know, he was still talking to people whose parents had said that either they were involved or their own parents were involved. Um, and that's, you know, you know, that's, and I just found that fascinating that something could occur like that pretty recently, all things considered, be written about by the cryptozoologist. And I had just never heard about it before until I started, you know, scouring for any cryptid to put in the book.
Yeah, they're, you know, I always go back to the Vietnam War and the some of the stories that have come out of there. You know, of course, like the rock apes, and then there have been these reptilian beings, the flying bat woman, and a few other things that have been, a lot of that could be folklore, but these soldiers swear they have seen these things, and I have talked to a few, and even I even talked to an older guy who's a vet in Vietnam who said that there were a few upright canine species there as well that his platoon had to deal with at one point. So it's quite interesting. I don't know. I just I It's hard for me to believe maybe, but I know that that a lot of the indigenous people, they know about it, but very rarely do they want to talk about it. Now my forte for the most part is the wing beings, the flying cryptids, and they're the ones I'm most fascinated with. And the in fact, I got a picture of the flying Vietnam woman, or whatever they want, a bat woman they want to call. And yeah, there was a sergeant or someone, a platoon leader, who actually recorded that, talked about it. And there have been others, of course, in the Philippines. There's quite a few of these bat-like vampire large beings. Philippines seems to have a whole slew of these things, these different types, and it's part of their lore too, as well as Indonesia and some of the other larger islands. So I like you. I find it absolutely fascinating, and we are always looking for information on winged humanoids throughout the world, not just here in North America.
Mhm. Yeah, there's definitely quite. I was quite surprised by how many winged hominids that there were. Um, some of them definitely veer much more into folklore. In Malaysia, there is the, gotta check the name real fast, and I'm probably gonna mispronounce this, so I apologize to any Malaysian viewers. But the Sigawo, which was quite interesting because there was definitely the component of this is the scary story that you tell your kids, but there was also elements of the Spanish colonialists going, oh, like these are the undesirable people who live in the woods, and
Yeah.
using that as like a tactic on the indigenous people of Malaysia. So that was quite interesting to look into, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more, um, research from a, I guess, not necessarily zoological, but just kind of looking into the folklore behind that. I definitely couldn't find a lot, although there was one book that had a whole chapter on it that was quite fun to read. But and yeah, so definitely very surprised by how many winged hominids that there were. There was quite a few other winged creatures as well. The ropen is probably the most well known, so I figure most people who are into cryptozoology would know that one. So that's
Yeah, the
definitely one
ropin
that.
is an interesting one. I mean, actually, that's my interest in pterodons, and pterosaurs. Actually, was the research that was taking place over in Papua New Guinea with the ropens. That's
Mhm.
quite an interesting thing. I mean, there have been some type of luminescence to them when they see them. And yeah, that and of course we have had these pterosaur sightings throughout North America as well, and I just find that fascinating. And I got a question here from Nancy Malcolm. Are there any sightings of ghost monkeys that you know
So not necessarily ghost monkeys. I assume it's something along the lines of monkeys that aren't in the correct place, as
Hmm.
opposed to paranormal monkeys. Although if that is what you mean, I apologize. I'm not too familiar with the more ghosts, phantoms side of it,
Hmm.
but there are several out of place monkeys that definitely came up. One of them was the Monkey Man of New Delhi, which is covered
Hmm.
in the India chapter. So that was basically um, one summer, I believe it was 2006.
Hmm.
Just everyone was reporting this monkey that was just harassing people. It was quite interesting to read because there was a lot of different theories about it. One of them was that it was a robot programmed by terrorists to, you know,
I hadn't
harass
heard that
people.
one.
Yeah, there was definitely some fun theories that came up with several of the cryptids, but uh, terrorist monkey was definitely one of the most interesting.
Well, I think
Um,
there was a death or two associated with those things too, where they had
yes,
got
yes,
come onto people's balconies,
hmm
and I don't know, had somehow there'd be a death associated with it. But yeah, when that happened, I actually remember when it started. The story started coming out. I had written about it a couple times, and yeah, the New Delhi Monkey Man. That and some of the drawings that people were coming up with were pretty profound.
hmm
So yeah, that was quite an interesting cryptid. Absolutely.
Yeah, another one was there was actually a monkey species in Singapore, which is a pretty small island nation that doesn't have a lot of
Hmm.
forests. So definitely quite interesting that there was even, one of the cryptid primates on that island. Um, there was not a ton of reports for that after a certain, I believe, 2009.
Hmm.
But it's definitely still interesting, and that could genuinely be one of those occasions where someone just released a pet monkey or or something along those lines. um, I know normally those explanations aren't too popular, but like Singapore, very small. It's not supporting a
Yeah.
population.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's mostly urban anyway. It's not a
Yes.
whole lot of not a lot of forest. Andrew Boyle asks, any mermaid sightings? We got a lot of mermaid sightings here in North America. And of course in Africa we hear about a lot of them. How about in Oceania or some of the countries in Asia? Have you come across any mermaid like or merman type of sightings?
So I didn't find any recent reports that were very, I don't want I guess compelling, so to speak.
Right.
You would get like the occasional one, but nothing sustained in like a particular area that would indicate like a population or anything like that. And there's definitely a lot tied up in folklore there.
Hmm.
Um, so they are not in the book, but there is still the interest, and you could definitely find some sightings where that. Mhm.
I had gotten a few. Now this is more South Asia or Middle East, but in the Black Sea around Crimea, there have been some merman sightings, and in Iran along the Caspian Sea, some of the fishermen in the Caspian Sea have talked about
Mhm.
seeing mermen, and so there've been quite a few. Um, but as far as in other areas, I haven't really heard of many myself.
Mhm.
Vincent wants to know about the pale humanoid creatures, what we call crawlers. I actually wrote a book about it. Uh, have you heard much about that in Asia?
I have not. So I can't recall offhand if I found any reports along those lines in
Hmm.
the area. Um, so yeah, I don't think I came across any. Um, you might be able to find reports from certain areas. I know a lot in the Pakistan area. There was a lot of folklore creatures that came up as cryptids, but I couldn't find anyone basically reporting them in, post 1500s, basically. Not that something couldn't exist beforehand. It's just, as far as writing, it's a little, complicated.
Okay. Nancy Malcolm asked, any new cryptid reports from Japan where the nuke accident at Fukushima happened a few years ago? I do know that some people had reported, though, after the fact, that they saw Mothman or winged humanoids above the Fukushima plant. But as far as in that area, I haven't heard of any. Have you heard of anything new in the area?
Not anything new, although,
Right.
Nancy, you might find this of interest. The hibagon, which is one of the cryptid primates from Japan.
Mm-hmm.
One of the explanations that I actually found put forward was that it was a survivor of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, and yeah, it was just, the survivor was just roaming around, and everyone was mistaking them for, a Sasquatch type creature. I couldn't find any Japanese sources on that. So I basically found it in one book that I had to get off the Internet Archive. So however much stock you want to put in that, but definitely something that did come up as far as, a nuclear disaster.
The only humanoid sighting that I know of in Japan, other than one winged humanoid sighting I got around Mount Fiji years ago, was, of course, at the Kappa. Now, people have talked about the Kappa for centuries. And it's part of their folklore. I guess it's actually a deity to some people in Japan. What did you come up with that? Do you remember any of that Kappa information that you may have reported on or researched?
Yeah, a lot of that is definitely based in current beliefs. So it was definitely something that I did consider putting in the book, but it was basically equivalent to if I was writing about North America and I said, "Oh yeah, a lot of people see angels," and not that like that's not worth writing about. There's certainly some writings you could do on that. I just think from a cryptozoology standpoint and dabbling into religious beliefs and such doesn't work as well, and would require quite a lot of trying to parse out like what is religious belief, what is genuinely seeing something, maybe even misinterpreting it. I don't want to say anything about anyone who's seen anything, but if you do have a religious belief, you see something weird, and you might explain it using your religious world belief. And that's, again, that's something worth covering, just not from a cryptozoology standpoint.
Right. Andrew Bull asked about sea monsters. Of course, we're getting into Oceania now. And, of course, we're very familiar with all the sea monster sightings by the whalers and other seamen from the United States and Canada. What have the islanders in the South Pacific and Oceania, what have they experienced? What do they talk about?
Yeah, so there's quite a few different sea monsters, lake monsters in Japan. There's actually two. It's Kasi and Issy, both of whom live in landlocked lakes. So definitely very interesting. Kasi is usually described as more of a plesiosaur, while Issy is described as eel-like. So, you kind of have both sides of the coin. Usually when you talk about something like the Loch Ness Monster, you get the debate over whether it's like a plesiosaur, whether it's like an eel. So that was definitely something interesting. There is also, I'm sure everyone's, familiar with the megalodon. That does get reported from time to time. Definitely from a scientific perspective, I guess would not I would not put money on it. But it is something that people have reported. And, I guess if they are still around, we'll have to get Jason Statham to, protect us. And I'm trying to think of, there are a couple other ones. There is another one in Japan that's basically a huge octopus. That is once again, apologies to any Japanese viewers, the Acarocumia. So just absolutely huge, octopus. The reports would actually dwarf even the giant squid, which is pretty huge.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's definitely something where you kind of look at and you go, especially when you're on the sea, things can get a bit. So, but definitely interesting. So, because that was another one I had never heard of before. So,
Yeah, I not long ago, was not too many years ago, there was an actual footage from of a large squid that a Japanese fisherman had pulled up, and they pulled up some pretty decent sized jellyfish as well, which I'm
yes.
quite sure could be mistaken for some type of sea creature in somebody's perspective. But yeah, there do seem to be some large squid out there. Of course, we've all heard about the kraken and the other so-called killer squid or killer octopus, but we have had some footage of some very large squid. Even down in Australia, there have been a few that have been captured and examined and looked at. So they're out there. I'm quite sure they're out there. There's
Yes,
just
it's
so little we
definitely
know.
very, very wild. Something like the giant squid and the colossal squid, where we basically only have a juvenile bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And they're already huge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, man, I definitely don't want to fight a giant squid anytime soon. I think if I saw one, I would just like, no,
I'm
I'm
not
good.
going near that thing.
Yeah.
They can chew you up pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
um I've heard so many crazy stories over the years from people in Asia of different things. Of course, the one that always fascinates me is the Mongolian death worm. That
Yes.
thing, and I know a couple of people who were in expeditions for these things. They didn't necessarily find one, but they, some of the things they talked about were pretty hairy. I mean, I don't know what do you believe is the existence of these things? You think they're real?
So I couldn't really find anything that led me to think, yes, this is definitely real. I have pretty decent confidence. But at the same time, there wasn't anything that made me think this definitely doesn't exist. There's definitely a lot of researchers talking to people who live in the area saying, I that's yeah, I don't know, my brother's cousin or something died because a Mongolian death worm made him. But also genuine fear, concern. So definitely something interesting is definitely going on there. I think some of the more outlandish claims about it, I know it used to be kind of part of the mythology that it could like shoot electrical currents. If I was going to put money on the Mongolian death worm, I would definitely not put money down on any laser electrical currents death worms. But there is still, again, going back to a lot of people who actually live in these areas see these creatures, and you know, scientists and Westerners in general will just go, no, like that can't happen. That's just wrong. And then, you know, we've seen time and time again that, you know, the people who actually live there were right. You know, with the coelacanth, the okapi, mountain gorillas, like there's just a whole list.
Absolutely.
So I mean, you know, when someone who actually lives in the area and multiple people who live in the area say, you know, like, you know, we've seen this thing for literal centuries, you know, it's kind of, you know, who am I to say no, that doesn't that's wrong. You're wrong.
Right.
And I've never been to Mongolia, so I definitely don't have, you know, the knowledge.
Every time I
say
see that picture of the death worm, I think about the huge worms from Dune. I don't know why, but it kind of reminds me of it.
Actually, it was funny. One of the things that came up while I was researching the Mongolian death worm was, and I'm blanking on the researcher's name. He actually did pass away semi recently, but he would actually use like sound vibrations, so similar, inspired by Dune, because obviously in Dune the worms would like
they'd be attracted to the vibration. Absolutely, interesting.
Exactly, and yeah, so he like developed like this device that, you know, just created like these minor tremors. So definitely interesting. So there is definitely a lot of, you know, crossover with Dune lore, I suppose.
Logan asked, any recent sightings or information on the Ninjan? He said they're fairly convincing pictures and videos. Yeah, I've seen a lot of those Ninjan pictures before. I don't know how real they are. They kind of seem obscure to me, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, so I honestly, I wouldn't say I looked too far into it. Again, that's a lot of trying to find the difference between cryptozoology and the folklore behind it and more paranormal things. And obviously, a lot of that can be a very hard line to draw. So it's not something that I would say I particularly looked into. But definitely something interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, Logan also mentioned something which is interesting about thought forms and being associated with cryptids. He talks about Slender Man, you know, and this is something else that I've looked at in my research as far as thought forms, people mind manifesting these creatures. And, you know, a lot of cryptozoologists have written about that. You know, tulpas are thought forms, not necessarily relics, but something being thought manifested and appearing.
Right.
And I believe that's entirely possible. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I put, you know, I'm very into the more paranormal explanations for cryptids. You know, I know there's a pretty decently common one where, you know, Bigfoot is either an alien or some kind of, you know, teleporting creature. And I again, like I don't, you know, I can't say whether that's not a thing.
Well, you're not going to hurt my feelings because I believe there's some connection there, but you know, you can say what you want to say. That's what you're on here for.
Yeah, it's, you know, I've met a ton of researchers who do a lot of great research on, you know, the connection there. I think from my personal standpoint, it's looking at, you know, the more physical manifestations. And again, you know, I think as long as everyone's kind of just respecting each other and, you know, all working towards like this common goal of figuring out what's going on, you know, I don't have a problem with it personally.
I don't know how long you've been involved with the community as far as cryptozoology and cryptids and such, but there has been a big chasm between the flesh and blood and the supernatural cryptid theories.
Yes, I remember.
There are people that are more open to it now, but there used to be a large chasm and a lot of arguments. You would go to a conference maybe 10, 15 years ago, and you'd have researchers there arguing with each other out in the open about it. But more recently, I think it's gotten to the point now, since, a lot of these things haven't showed up physically, or we have no evidence of them. In particular, I'm talking about Bigfoot or canine cryptids or such. That, some people are starting to open up and say, well, maybe there is something to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like, I don't discount the paranormal at all.
Yeah.
And I definitely do remember a lot of the in-person fights, never, ignoring, like, just huge fights in Facebook groups and such. Because I lived in Texas at the time, so there was a lot of talk of, well, if people keep shooting at Bigfoot and they keep missing, where's the body? So yeah, again, that's just not something that, if I could dedicate my whole life to finding cryptids, I don't think that's really an avenue that I would really pursue. But if it's true,
why do you think we haven't found any real physical evidence of cryptids for the most part?
Yeah, I think it kind of varies by cryptid. And I know that's kind of a cop-out answer. Something like Bigfoot, and admittedly, that is not my main area of research. Right. But things are pretty quick to decompose. And something is, like, humanity's had burial rituals for, centuries. And, like, there's Neanderthals where we've seen them have these funeral burial rituals. So who's to say that a semi-advanced primate doesn't also have something like that? And now that I'm saying that, I think chimpanzees or gorillas have something relatively similar. So, or
maybe they eat each other. I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know some chimpanzees will actually do that.
Yes.
So
I think bonobos do too. So
bonobos do.
Yes.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think it does just kind of depend by cryptid, and some of them, honestly, some of them just might not exist. I don't want to say, like, oh yeah, this definitely doesn't exist. But there is, that thing, that thought. But also a lot of, like, cryptids in Asia and Oceania, they are in those areas that aren't necessarily being explored frequently. And going back to, decomposing, like, let's say you have, like an orang pendek, and it passes away. It, like, it just dies in the forest one day. It might be years before someone even steps in, like, a square kilometer of that area.
Oh, absolutely.
And by that point, something might have picked off the bones, the skin's gone. So it's definitely something that varies by cryptid. Again, I would never say, oh no, like, like this theory is definitely wrong unless there is something, very wrong with it. But I don't think with, the paranormal or extraterrestrial Bigfoot or other cryptids, like, I don't think that's, like, inherently wrong.
Right.
And, again, as long as we're all collaborating to figure out the mystery, I think that's all that matters. Like detectives working together, if they have different culprits in mind, they don't start yelling at each other or what have you.
I wish it was like that, but realistically, it just does not turn out that way many times.
That's true.
Unfortunately. Vincent wanted to know, and I did too. Have you had any encounters yourself or cryptids or even the paranormal?
So not with cryptids, although interestingly enough, I was in Point Pleasant in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was July or August. And I was actually staying in the room that John Keel had been in when he was writing the Mothman prophecies.
Mm-hmm.
My parents specifically booked that because I was very fascinated with Mothman. And at one point, I had gotten up to go get water from, the in-suite bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was coming back out, and I kind of like looked to the right, and there was like this white haze in the mirror. And I was like, oh, this is, I don't like that. So I like hid under the covers, and I was like clutching the Bible. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die. And I kept like peeking out to see if it had gone away, but it was, regardless of like the angle you were looking at, it was just kind of always there. And eventually I just I got up and I ran to my parents' room, and I was like, switch rooms with me. I want to stay with mom. And my dad slept there, and he didn't see anything. So
Right.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, Point Pleasant kind of grows on people. I've been there several times. Well, I have always been fascinated with the Mothman and winged humanoids. I had an encounter back in '88 myself. And it's and of course our team has been involved with the Chicago Mothman phenomena since 2011. And we've written several books about them. So but it all comes back to Point Pleasant, and there's just something about that town. It's not just the Mothman. There's just so much going on there.
Yes.
It's
and
it's
the
imprinted.
TNT area too. Like
Yeah.
we did go explore that, and
Did you?
there's just a feeling. It's not even necessarily.
Yeah.
I've heard people when they describe like paranormal experience, they're like, I just felt like this evil in the room, and it wasn't necessarily that. It was just odd.
I think, particularly in the McClintock or the West Virginia Ordnance Works area, that people call the TNT plant, I believe there's some very strong indigenous energy there. Mm-hmm. And, I have heard a ton of EVPs coming out of there. I've heard things myself being there. I've researched the area a couple times over the years myself and have been with other people. And, it never fails to amaze me with something. There's something always turns up. And of course, the Mothman sightings are still taking place in the area, that whole county, and the whole area overall. I mean, we have had a fair amount of winged humanoid or Mothman sightings in there, plus other things. So, that town is, there's something about Point Pleasant. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's that Mothman statue. I think it's cursed.
I don't know. I've had people tell me that before. I've had people who said they've had pictures taken with those things, with that thing, and it just freaks them out. I don't know.
I remember, back in the day when I was in middle school, one of my science teacher actually dared me to do a whole presentation on cryptozoology, because I was always use cryptid examples for like projects and such.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then on my Mothman slide, I had a photo of that statue. Mm-hmm. And every time I see the statue, it just makes me laugh, because I could just remember my teacher going, "Hold up, Carol, does that thing have like 6-pack abs?" Like, wow, like,
that statue has always fascinated me, because quite honestly, it doesn't look anything like any of the descriptions of that thing, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. It looks more like what we've been seeing out in Chicago as opposed to what we saw in Point Pleasant.
Right.
and with the big bulging red eyes, and the kind of actual human body. I mean, they called it Mothman for a reason, because it looked like a friggin' moth.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, everybody, people I talk, they always bring up the Mothman Prophecies movie, but quite frankly, if they hadn't read Mothman Prophecies book, then they're
Yeah.
just really missing out, because the movie really did not do the book justice whatsoever.
Hmm. Yeah, I
So,
remember. Yeah, when I was very into Mothman studies, I read the book and then I watched the movie, and I think that was the first time as a kid that I, had that experience of the book is better than the movie,
mhm.
which is, usually people just complain about Harry Potter or such, but no, it was the Mothman prophecies for me.
Yeah, well, for my son and I, my son and I both read the Da Vinci Code, and we went to see the movie, and we were really disappointed. But that happens a lot. I mean, there's a lot of big movies that really do not do the book justice whatsoever. So yeah, that's unfortunate. So you've tackled cryptids of Asia and Oceania this time. Do you have any plans to write about any cryptids or any other paranormal or supernatural subjects?
So I every time someone asks me that, I've been saying I don't really have a plan for anything,
Mm-hmm.
but I think I do want to do like a full deep dive on the Nittawo, the Sri Lankan cryptid that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I just think I think there's a lot there, and it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, whether from cryptozoologists or from mainstream researchers of any kind. And I really like to just kind of deep dive into that. Um,
Okay.
but otherwise, I don't have any plans for a sequel, or focus on a different region or anything. Just kind of maybe something will strike my fancy, but otherwise, no firm plans.
Yeah. Well, I said that too when I wrote my first book, and
Hmm.
then 9 books later, you know. So yeah, that does happen. But no, I mean, I think you should actually like you said, find a subject that really fascinates you and go deep into it. That Sri Lankan cryptid, I'd be honest with you, I'd never heard of it, or I don't remember it. So absolutely, I'd say go for it.
Right on.
Yeah. So, do you have any conferences or anything like that scheduled, or are you going to be doing book signings or doing anything like that sort?
So I don't have anything planned as far as conferences or specific book signings go.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, but if you do want a signed copy, feel free to honestly reach out to Beyond the Fray. I'd be happy to do that for any listener who's interested. You can also get my contact information if you read the book and you're just curious about one of the cryptids. Usually, pretty much everything I research got put in there.
Mm-hmm.
For some of the cryptids, there wasn't a lot, so kind of had to put everything in there. um, but, yeah. And I would love to go to a conference. Again, back when I was living in Texas, we would go to the Texas Bigfoot Research Conference like every
Mm-hmm.
year. So I would definitely love to be able to go to a conference, give a presentation, sign some books, get to know people.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that would be a ton of fun. So
Well, you're young yet, so you got a long way you can go. And it's nice to see younger folks get involved with cryptozoology.
mhm.
Um, it's just not us old farts that are doing it, and there's a lot of younger people getting involved with it as well. You may actually want to start, and I don't know if you have a website or not. You may want to start doing some type of updates and stuff to keep people informed. It may help you in selling books and getting people interested in your research.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely something, might definitely consider. I should also mention, I guess, while we're asking about my, future plans and such. So my father is actually now working for the Center for Fortean Zoology as the Canadian chair. So he is working on getting a group to go to a particular park to go on a Sasquatch expedition. So if anyone is interested in that, I would definitely reach out to the Center for Fortean Zoology. My dad's David Scott, so tell him I
Oh,
sent you.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So and we can get that set up. I will definitely be going to that. So that will be my first Sasquatch expedition. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, excellent. Well, Carol, thanks for coming on tonight. It was great having you. And, any updates come, let me know.
All right. Definitely. Great talking to you.
You
And
take
thank
care
you
and have,
to everyone who came out.
okay, you have a good weekend now.
Yeah, you too.
So if you have a sighting or encounter report that you'd like considered for the personal report show or post to the Families of Monsters, please feel free to forward to my email at lonstrickler.com. Well, excuse me, lonstrickler@familiesofmonsters.com. Sorry. And I want to thank Carol Scott for joining me this evening. And thanks to each and all of you for watching and chatting. And if you made a super chat donation, it's truly appreciated. Your support is what makes all this possible. So please like, subscribe, share, and even comment. So next Friday, we are going to conduct a flying cryptid roundtable, and our guest will be Ken Gerhard, Ron Murphy, and Jason McLean. So that'll be a quite interesting show. I hope you all take some time and come on live and present some questions to these guys. This is a great lineup. Of course, with Ken there and Ron and Jason, they're all deeply involved with the flying cryptids and other cryptozoologies, other cryptids as well. So please, it should be quite an interesting roundtable. So stay tuned for Bernadette McDaniel's A Paranormal Life here on Families of Monsters Radio at 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific time. So until we meet again, stay healthy and be safe.